On a crisp October morning in 2012, 15-year-old Emma Hartley vanished without a trace from the dense pine forests surrounding Millbrook, Oregon. She had gone on what was supposed to be a simple afternoon hike with her younger brother Tyler, following the familiar trail they had walked countless times since childhood. The autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke from the small logging town where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were supposed to be impossible to keep. Tyler had stopped to tie his shoelace near the old wooden bridge that crossed Miller Creek, and when he looked up 30 seconds later, his sister had simply disappeared. No scream, no struggle, no sound except the gentle rush of water over smooth stones and the whisper of wind through towering Douglas firs. He called her name until his voice grew hoarse, searched every path and clearing he could think of, then ran the 2 miles back to town faster than he had ever run in his life. If you're following this incredible story of mystery and hope, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Your support helps us bring you more of these remarkable true stories that remind us of the resilience of the human spirit. The search began immediately. Sheriff Patricia Coleman had seen her share of missing persons cases in her 23 years of law enforcement, but something about Emma's disappearance felt different from the start. The girl was responsible, athletic, and knew the forest better than most adults in town. She wasn't the type to wander off or take unnecessary risks. Within hours, search and rescue teams from 3 counties had converged on Millbrook, bringing tracking dogs, helicopters, and dozens of volunteers who combed through thousands of acres of wilderness. Emma's parents, David and Linda Hartley, were respected members of the community. David managed the local credit union, while Linda taught 4th grade at Millbrook Elementary. They were the kind of family that neighbors turned to in times of trouble, always ready with a casserole for someone in need or a helping hand during harvest season. The irony that they now found themselves in desperate need of help wasn't lost on anyone in town. Their home on Maple Street, with its white picket fence and carefully tended garden, had always been a symbol of stability and normalcy in Millbrook. Now it became command central for the most intensive search operation the region had ever seen. For 3 weeks, the search continued with an intensity that surprised even seasoned rescue workers. The FBI joined the investigation, interviewing everyone who had seen Emma in the days before her disappearance. They learned that she had been excited about her upcoming Sweet 16 party, had been accepted to a summer marine biology program she desperately wanted to attend, and had recently started dating Jake Morrison, a senior on the high school football team. There was no indication she was unhappy or planning to run away. Her diary, which her parents reluctantly allowed investigators to read, contained the typical thoughts and concerns of a teenage girl looking forward to her future. The forest revealed nothing, despite the exhaustive efforts of search teams. They found an old campsite that might have been used by transients, a few pieces of torn clothing that turned out to belong to other hikers, and countless false leads that raised hopes only to dash them again. The tracking dogs lost her scent at the creek, as if she had simply vanished into thin air. Psychics called from across the country offering their services. Conspiracy theorists suggested everything from alien abduction to government cover-ups. The Hartley family listened to every theory, followed every lead, and slowly watched their savings disappear as they hired private investigators and offered increasingly large rewards for information. The media attention was overwhelming at first, with news crews from Portland and Seattle setting up camp in the town square. Emma's photograph appeared on milk cartons and missing person websites across the Pacific Northwest. Her story was featured on national television programs dedicated to unsolved mysteries. But as weeks turned to months without any substantial leads, the media circus gradually packed up and moved on to other stories, leaving the Hartley family to face their nightmare in relative solitude. By Christmas of 2012, the official search had been scaled back to occasional volunteer efforts and the distribution of missing person flyers at truck stops and rest areas throughout the Pacific Northwest. Emma's bedroom remained exactly as she had left it, her homecoming dress still hanging in the closet, her college brochures neatly stacked on her desk. Linda would sit in that room for hours, holding her daughter's favorite sweater and breathing in the fading scent of her vanilla perfume. She had read every book on grieving and missing persons she could find, attended support groups in Portland, and consulted with specialists who worked with families of the disappeared, but nothing could fill the Emma-shaped hole in their lives. The case that had once dominated local headlines gradually faded from public attention. Other tragedies occurred, other families faced their own crises, and the rhythm of small-town life slowly adjusted to the absence of Emma Hartley. But for those who loved her most, time seemed suspended in that terrible moment when Tyler had looked up from tying his shoe to find his sister gone. The family learned to navigate holidays and birthdays with forced smiles and private tears, always leaving an empty chair at the table just in case this would be the day she came home. David threw himself into his work at the credit union, often staying late into the evening rather than facing the empty silence at home. He became obsessed with financial security, as if ensuring the family's economic stability could somehow protect them from further loss. Linda took a leave of absence from teaching and spent her days maintaining Emma's social media accounts, sharing her photo on missing persons websites, and coordinating with other families of missing children. She found purpose in helping others navigate the complex world of missing persons investigations, becoming an unofficial expert on resources and procedures that she never wanted to know existed. Tyler, racked with guilt over those 30 seconds when he hadn't been watching, struggled through his remaining years of high school like a ghost haunting familiar hallways. His grades, once excellent, plummeted as he battled depression and survivor's guilt. Classmates didn't know how to talk to him. Teachers offered well-meaning but inadequate support, and he found himself increasingly isolated. The football team dedicated their season to Emma, and Jake Morrison, her boyfriend, dropped out of school entirely, unable to cope with the constant reminders of what had been lost. The investigation officially remained open, but Sheriff Coleman knew the statistics as well as anyone. The chances of finding Emma alive decreased dramatically with each passing month. After the first year, the case file was moved to the cold case section, though Coleman made sure to review it regularly and follow up on any new leads that trickled in. She had promised the Hartley family she would never give up, and she intended to keep that promise even as hope grew thinner with each passing season. The file grew thick with false sightings, dead-end leads, and the desperate theories of amateur investigators who thought they could solve what professionals could not. Years passed with agonizing slowness. The Hartley family learned to navigate birthdays and holidays with an empty chair at the table, to field well-meaning questions from acquaintances who had forgotten the anniversary of Emma's disappearance, and to live with the constant ache of not knowing. They attended support groups for families of missing persons where they met others caught in the same terrible limbo between grief and hope. Some families had been waiting decades for answers. Others had found closure, though not always the kind they had prayed for. The group became a second family of sorts, bound together by shared experience and mutual understanding of a pain that outsiders could never fully comprehend. The town of Millbrook gradually healed around the wound of Emma's absence, but the scar remained visible to those who looked closely. The trail where she had vanished was rarely used anymore, and parents kept their children closer when venturing into the forest. Emma's story became part of local folklore, told in hushed whispers around campfires and shared as a cautionary tale about the dangers that could lurk even in familiar places. Her former classmates graduated and moved away, carrying with them the sobering knowledge that safety was an illusion and that life could change irrevocably in an instant. The annual searches continued for several years, organized by volunteers and coordinated by the Hartley family. Each autumn, dozens of people would gather at the trailhead, armed with maps and determination, combing through areas that had been searched countless times before. These efforts yielded nothing but provided a sense of purpose and community solidarity that helped sustain hope. Local businesses donated supplies, churches organized prayer vigils, and the entire town seemed to rally around the belief that somehow, some way, Emma would be found. As time wore on, the searches became smaller and less frequent, but they never stopped entirely. A core group of dedicated volunteers, led by Emma's Uncle Robert and her former teacher, Mrs. Patterson, continued to organize periodic efforts. They expanded their search area, consulted with new experts, and utilized advancing technology like ground-penetrating radar and improved GPS mapping. Each new tool brought renewed hope and fresh disappointment when it failed to provide the breakthrough they desperately sought. By 2018, Tyler had graduated high school and was attending Oregon State University, studying criminal justice with the hope of one day joining the FBI and helping other families find the answers his own family had been denied. His choice of major surprised no one who knew the family's story. He threw himself into his studies with the same intensity his father brought to work and his mother brought to advocacy, as if academic excellence could somehow honor Emma's memory and prepare him for the day when he might finally learn what had happened to his sister. Linda had returned to teaching, but found herself drawn to working with at-risk youth, pouring her maternal energy into students who needed extra care and attention. She became known as the teacher who never gave up on difficult cases, who saw potential in troubled kids that others had written off. Her colleagues understood that her dedication came from a place of profound loss, and they marveled at her ability to transform personal tragedy into a force for good in other young lives. David had aged visibly in the years since Emma's disappearance, his hair now completely grey and deep lines etched around his eyes from countless sleepless nights. The family had learned to live with uncertainty, to function despite the constant undercurrent of loss that colored every interaction and decision. They had grown closer in some ways, bound together by shared grief and the unspoken understanding that they were the only ones who truly comprehended the magnitude of what had been taken from them. Yet they had also grown more fragile, quicker to worry when someone was late coming home, more protective of the relationships they still had. Simple pleasures like family hikes or camping trips became impossible, too loaded with painful memories and irrational fears. Sheriff Coleman, now in her final year before retirement, continued to keep Emma's case file on her desk. She had investigated hundreds of cases over the decades, but this one haunted her in a way that few others had. Perhaps it was the family's dignity in the face of unimaginable loss, or the way the entire community had rallied around them. Perhaps it was simply the randomness of it all, the terrible reminder that safety was often just an illusion and that lives could be changed forever in the space of a heartbeat. As her retirement approached, she worried about leaving the case to her successor, uncertain whether anyone else would maintain the same level of personal investment in finding answers. On a humid Tuesday morning in July 2023, exactly 11 years and 9 months after Emma Hartley had vanished from the Oregon forest, Sheriff Coleman received a phone call that would change everything. The voice on the other end belonged to Detective Maria Rodriguez from the Tucson Police Department, and she was calling about a young woman who had walked into their station that morning with an incredible story to tell. Coleman's heart began racing before Rodriguez had finished her first sentence, a mixture of hope and dread that had become familiar over the years whenever new information surfaced about Emma's case. The woman, who appeared to be in her mid-20s, had approached the front desk of the Tucson Police Department just after sunrise, wearing worn jeans and a faded T-shirt that looked like they had seen better days. She spoke quietly, almost hesitantly, as she told the desk sergeant that she believed she might be a missing person from Oregon. When pressed for details, she had provided a name that sent shockwaves through the department: Emma Hartley. The desk sergeant, a veteran officer named Tom Bradley, had heard enough missing person reports over the years to recognize when someone was telling the truth, and something in this young woman's eyes convinced him that her story deserved immediate attention. Detective Rodriguez had been called in within minutes of the woman's arrival. Rodriguez specialized in missing persons cases and had a reputation for thoroughness that had solved several high-profile disappearances over her 15-year career. She had been skeptical at first when Bradley briefed her on the situation. Missing persons cases that resolved themselves after more than a decade were extremely rare, and she had seen enough false leads and mistaken identities to approach such claims with healthy skepticism. But something about the young woman's manner, the specific details she was able to provide about her life before her disappearance, and most convincingly, a distinctive scar on her left ankle from a childhood accident, began to paint a picture that was impossible to ignore. The woman calling herself Emma Hartley told a story that seemed almost too incredible to believe. She claimed to have no memory of the first several months after her disappearance, describing them as lost in a fog of fear and confusion. What she did remember was waking up in a small cabin somewhere in the desert southwest, in the care of a man who called himself Uncle Ray, and insisted that her parents had died in a car accident and that he was her only living relative. The story had been delivered so convincingly, with such specific details about the supposed accident and her parents' final moments, that her 15-year-old mind had accepted it as truth, even as her heart rebelled against the possibility. Ray had been patient and seemingly kind, she explained, never raising his voice or treating her harshly. He had taught her to help with his small-scale farming operation, growing vegetables and raising chickens on a remote property outside of Tucson. He had homeschooled her using old textbooks and workbooks, telling her that traditional schools were dangerous places where children were corrupted and families were torn apart. For years, she had no reason to doubt his version of events, especially since her memories of her life before were fragmented and painful to access. Ray had explained that this was normal, a result of the trauma she had experienced, and that trying to remember would only cause her more pain. The property where she lived with Ray was isolated, accessible only by a long dirt road that wound through miles of desert scrubland. They rarely encountered other people, and on the few occasions when they did, Ray would introduce her as his niece, who was being raised away from the corrupting influences of modern society. Their neighbors, few as they were, seemed to accept this explanation without question. In rural Arizona, people minded their own business and respected others' choices to live off the grid. The nearest town was 40 minutes away by truck, and trips there were infrequent and always supervised by Ray, who claimed that too much exposure to modern society would be harmful to her recovery. As the years passed, the young woman who had once been Emma Hartley began to accept her new reality. The memories of her life in Oregon faded like old photographs, left too long in sunlight, replaced by the rhythm of desert living and the constant presence of the man she knew as Uncle Ray. She learned to tend vegetables in the harsh soil, to preserve food for the long summer months, and to find satisfaction in the simple routines of rural life. Ray was an adequate teacher, providing her with basic education in reading, writing, and arithmetic, though always filtering information through his own worldview about the dangers of modern society and the corruption of traditional institutions. The isolation was profound, but became normal over time. She had no access to television, internet, or newspapers. Her only window into the outside world came through Ray's carefully curated stories about increasing violence, moral decay, and social collapse that made their isolated existence seem like a refuge rather than a prison. She learned to can vegetables, repair equipment, and handle the practical challenges of off-grid living. In many ways, she became exceptionally capable and self-sufficient, though always within the narrow confines of the life Ray had constructed for her. But Ray had made one crucial mistake that would eventually unravel his carefully constructed deception. As she grew older and more mature, he had begun to allow her occasional supervised trips into Tucson for supplies and medical care. These trips were necessary as she developed health issues that couldn't be treated with home remedies, and Ray's paranoia about outside contact had to be balanced against practical needs. He always accompanied her and controlled every interaction, but these brief glimpses of the outside world began to plant seeds of doubt about his version of reality. It was during one of these trips, just 3 weeks before she walked into the police station, that she had glimpsed something that shattered her carefully constructed world. A missing person poster with her own face on it, aged and updated to show what she might look like as an adult. The poster had been tucked among dozens of others on a bulletin board at a truck stop outside the city. She had stared at it in shocked recognition, her heart pounding as she read the details of Emma Hartley's disappearance from Millbrook, Oregon in 2012. The dates, the physical description, even the scar on her ankle that the poster mentioned, everything matched perfectly. But most devastating of all was the realization that her parents, David and Linda Hartley, were not dead, as Ray had claimed, but were still alive and had been searching for her all these years. The poster included their photograph, older than she remembered but unmistakably the faces that had haunted her dreams for over a decade. In that moment, standing in a truck stop bathroom with Ray waiting outside, her entire world collapsed and reformed around a truth she could no longer deny. She was not an orphan being cared for by a benevolent uncle. She was a kidnapping victim whose family had never stopped looking for her. The drive back to Ray's property that day had been the longest of her life. She sat in the passenger seat of his old pickup truck, her mind racing as she tried to process the magnitude of what she had discovered. Ray chatted about ordinary things, the weather, the chickens, plans for expanding the vegetable garden, while she struggled to maintain a facade of normalcy. Every word he spoke now seemed loaded with deception, every kindness revealed as manipulation. The man she had trusted for 11 years, the only family she thought she had left, was the architect of the most elaborate lie imaginable. That night, she lay awake in her small bedroom, staring at the ceiling and trying to reconcile 11 years of life with a man who had stolen her from her family and convinced her to be grateful for it. She thought about her parents, imagining their pain and the years of searching they had endured. She thought about Tyler, her little brother who would now be a grown man, and wondered if he blamed himself for her disappearance. The guilt was overwhelming, not just for the years of worry she had caused, but for the times she had actually felt grateful to Ray for saving her from what he claimed was a dangerous world. For 3 weeks, she had carefully planned her escape. Ray trusted her completely after so many years, and it wasn't difficult to find opportunities to slip away. She had taken a bus into Tucson, using money she had saved from selling eggs and vegetables at a small farmer's market that Ray occasionally allowed her to attend. The bus ride had been terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. The first time in over a decade that she had traveled anywhere alone, the first taste of the freedom that had been taken from her as a frightened 15-year-old girl in an Oregon forest. Detective Rodriguez listened to this incredible story with a mixture of amazement and professional skepticism. She had heard elaborate fabrications before, and she knew that people sometimes inserted themselves into famous cases for attention or psychological reasons. But the details were remarkably consistent and emotionally authentic. The woman's knowledge of specific aspects of the original case, combined with her obvious emotional distress and the physical evidence of the scar, began to build a compelling case for her true identity. Rodriguez had immediately begun the process of verifying the young woman's claims, starting with a call to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and then reaching out to the agency that had handled the original investigation. The verification process involved multiple layers of evidence and cross-checking. Dental records, if they could be located after so many years, would be definitive. DNA samples could be compared against evidence collected from Emma's bedroom in 2012. But even before those scientific confirmations came back, the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. The woman knew details about the Hartley family that had never been made public, could describe the layout of their home and the location of Emma's favorite hiding places, and possessed intimate knowledge of family traditions and inside jokes that would be impossible for an imposter to fake. When Sheriff Coleman received that call from Tucson, she had been reviewing case files as part of preparing for her retirement. She had just finished reading through Emma Hartley's file for what she thought might be the last time, noting the anniversary of the disappearance that was approaching in a few months. The voice on the other end of the phone seemed to come from another world as it delivered news that she had hoped for but never really expected to hear. Her hands shook as she took notes, and she found herself asking Rodriguez to repeat certain details just to make sure she had heard correctly. The verification process moved quickly once law enforcement agencies, on both ends, began comparing notes and sharing information. Dental records, miraculously preserved in the files of Emma's childhood dentist, provided the first definitive confirmation. DNA samples taken from the young woman in Tucson matched genetic material collected from Emma's hairbrush 11 years earlier. But perhaps most convincingly, the woman was able to provide details about the day of her disappearance that only Emma would know, including a conversation she had had with Tyler about their plans for their mother's upcoming birthday, a detail that had never been shared with investigators or made public. Federal agents became involved as the case officially became a kidnapping investigation rather than a missing person case. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was consulted to help understand the psychological dynamics of the long-term captivity and to prepare for the challenges of reunification. Experts in trauma and recovery were brought in to advise on the best approaches for helping Emma readjust to the world she had been taken from and to support her family as they navigated this miraculous but complex development. But informing the Hartley family would require careful handling. 11 years of grief and uncertainty had changed them all, and the news that Emma was alive and safe would be overwhelming in ways that were difficult to predict. Sheriff Coleman knew that reuniting families after long separations could be as traumatic as it was joyful, requiring patience and professional support to navigate successfully. She had consulted with psychologists who specialized in family reunification cases, learning about the common challenges and best practices for managing such delicate situations. The call to David and Linda Hartley came on a Thursday evening in late July. They had been finishing dinner, discussing Tyler's upcoming graduation from college and Linda's plans for her classroom in the fall, when the phone rang. These days, unexpected calls still caused a flutter of anxiety, though they had learned not to get their hopes up when law enforcement contacted them. Usually it was about another false lead or another case that investigators thought might be connected to Emma's disappearance. Sheriff Coleman had rehearsed what she would say, but when Linda's familiar voice answered, the words almost stuck in her throat. "Linda, this is Sheriff Coleman. I need you and David to sit down. I have news about Emma." The formality in Coleman's voice immediately set off alarm bells. After 11 years, the Hartley family had developed a finely tuned sense for distinguishing between routine updates and genuinely significant developments. The tone in Coleman's voice suggested that this was something different, something that would change everything. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds before Linda's voice, suddenly small and frightened, asked the question that had tormented her for more than a decade. "Did you find her body?" It was the question she both dreaded and needed answered, the terrible possibility that would bring closure but destroy hope forever. "No," Coleman replied, her own voice thick with emotion she couldn't quite control. "Linda, Emma is alive. She's safe, and she wants to come home." The words seemed to hang in the air, too incredible to be real, too wonderful to be true. Coleman could hear Linda's sharp intake of breath, followed by complete silence as the magnitude of the news began to sink in. The sound that came through the phone was unlike anything Coleman had heard in all her years of delivering difficult news. It was part sob, part scream, part prayer, the sound of a heart breaking open after being held closed for so long. She could hear David's voice in the background, demanding to know what was happening, and then his own cry of disbelief and joy as Linda managed to repeat what she had been told. The connection was filled with the sounds of a family's world being turned upside down in the most wonderful way possible. The reunion would take place in Tucson, with Emma choosing to remain there until her family could travel to her. The young woman who had once been a carefree teenager in Oregon was now an adult who had lived through experiences that most people couldn't imagine. She needed time to prepare herself for seeing the family she'd been separated from for so long, and they needed time to process the miracle they had been granted. Psychologists recommended a gradual reintroduction with careful attention to managing expectations and emotions on all sides. Tyler had been in his apartment near campus when his mother called, and he had dropped his textbooks and driven home through the night, barely able to see the road through his tears. For 11 years, he had carried the guilt of those 30 seconds when he hadn't been watching his sister. He had built his entire adult life around the goal of helping other families avoid the pain his own had endured. Now, he would have the chance to tell her how sorry he was, and how much he had missed her, to finally release the burden of guilt that had shaped every decision he had made since that terrible day in the forest. The flight to Arizona was surreal for the Hartley family. After more than a decade of not knowing, they were hours away from seeing Emma again. Linda clutched a photo of her daughter as a 15-year-old, trying to imagine what she would look like now as a grown woman of 26. David stared out the airplane window at the landscape below, still hardly able to believe that this day had finally come. They had imagined this moment thousands of times over the years, but now that it was actually happening, it felt like stepping into a dream that might evaporate at any moment. The preparation for the reunion had been extensive, involving multiple conversations with counselors, law enforcement officials, and experts in family reunification. Everyone involved understood that while this was a joyous occasion, it was also potentially traumatic for all parties. Emma had lived an entire adult life that her family knew nothing about. They had aged and changed in ways she couldn't have imagined. The dynamics of their relationships would need to be rebuilt from scratch, based on who they all were now rather than who they had been 11 years ago. The reunion itself took place in a conference room at the Tucson Police Department, with counselors and law enforcement officers present to provide support if needed. The room had been arranged to feel as comfortable and non-institutional as possible, with soft lighting and comfortable seating, but nothing could have prepared any of them for the emotional impact of that first moment when the door opened and Emma walked through. When Emma walked through the door, the years seemed to collapse into nothing. She was taller now, her face more mature, her hair longer and sun-lightened from years in the desert. Her movements were different too, more cautious, more deliberate, shaped by years of isolation and careful living. But her eyes were the same deep brown that her family remembered. And when she smiled tentatively at her family, It was the smile they had carried in their hearts for 11 long years. The embrace that followed lasted for several minutes, with all 4 members of the Hartley family holding on to each other as if they might disappear again if they let go. There were tears and whispered words of love and disbelief, and for a moment the conference room in a police station in Arizona became the most sacred space in the world. Emma was overwhelmed by how much her parents had aged, while they marveled at seeing their little girl transformed into a woman they barely recognized but loved completely. Tyler, now 24 and taller than his sister for the first time in their lives, could barely speak through his tears as he told her how sorry he was for looking away, for not protecting her, for failing in his job as her little brother. Emma, who had spent years wondering if her family blamed her for disappearing, was amazed to discover that Tyler blamed himself. It was the first of many revelations about how differently they had each processed the trauma of that day. But even as they celebrated this incredible reunion, everyone present understood that the journey ahead would be complex and challenging. Emma would need extensive counseling to process her experiences and adjust to a world that had changed dramatically since 2012. She had lived through the entire smartphone revolution, the rise of social media, and countless cultural and technological changes while isolated in the Arizona desert. The family would need to rebuild relationships that had been frozen in time and learn to navigate the trauma they had all endured in different ways. The investigation into her disappearance and captivity was just beginning, with federal agents now involved in tracking down the man who had stolen 11 years of her life and caused immeasurable pain to her family. Ray's property outside Tucson had been raided within hours of Emma's arrival at the police station, but he had vanished, apparently aware that his carefully constructed deception had finally crumbled. Evidence collected from the property would help build the case against him, though finding him would prove to be another challenge entirely. As news of Emma's recovery spread through carefully managed media releases, the story captured international attention. The young woman who had vanished from an Oregon forest and emerged 11 years later from the Arizona desert became a symbol of hope for other families facing similar tragedies. Her story was featured on news programs around the world, inspiring other missing persons to come forward and other families to never give up hope. The Hartley family, working with victim advocates, carefully controlled the flow of information to protect Emma's privacy while still acknowledging the public interest in her story. The process of rebuilding their family life would take time and patience. Emma had to adjust to a world filled with technology she had never seen, social changes she couldn't have imagined, and family members who were essentially strangers despite their shared history. Simple things like using a smartphone or navigating social media were completely foreign to her. The family had to learn to balance their joy at having her back with respect for her need to process her experiences and adjust at her own pace. Today, Emma is slowly rebuilding her life, surrounded by the family who never stopped looking for her. She has chosen to remain largely out of the public eye, focusing on healing and reconnecting with the world she was taken from. The adjustment has been challenging but rewarding, with each small milestone: her first movie in a theater, her first restaurant meal, her first shopping trip, representing another step back into the life that was stolen from her. The Hartley family has become advocates for other missing persons cases, using their experience to help other families navigate the complex emotions and practical challenges of long-term disappearances. The forest trail where Emma disappeared has been renamed in her honor, and the town of Millbrook has established a foundation that provides support for families of missing persons. Sheriff Coleman, who retired shortly after Emma's recovery, continues to volunteer with missing persons organizations, carrying with her the reminder that even the most hopeless cases can sometimes have miraculous endings. The case that defined the final years of her career became a testament to the importance of never giving up, never closing the door on hope, and always believing that families can be reunited. Emma's story stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of never giving up hope. It reminds us that families separated by tragedy can be reunited, that love can survive even the longest separations, and that sometimes, against all odds, people do come home. Her 11 years in the wilderness have ended, but her journey toward healing and rebuilding has only just begun. The little girl who vanished from an Oregon forest has returned as a strong, capable woman, ready to reclaim the life that was taken from her and to build new memories with the family who never stopped believing she would come home.